Hi, everyone. John Hammontree here, and welcome back to the Reckon Interview Live. Today, we are chatting with Adam Harris of The Atlantic about how schools are dealing with the coronavirus pandemic and the transition that they may or may not be making to in-person and online education in the fall. Adam, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's talk about what you're seeing in terms of broad strokes so far. What are some of the big trends that are happening nationally in terms of how schools are approaching the fall semester?
Yeah, so it's been interesting to watch over the last couple of months how schools have kind of transitioned their planning. I think you know, when you're thinking about May and all of the contingency planning that was kind of going into making some of these decisions, a lot of institutions had kind of started to say, yes, we will be back on campus in some way or another. As you move into June, it kind of becomes a lot of schools start to have kind of a realization that the semester is going to look radically different than it has in years prior, and even than they thought it might in March or April. You start to see a spike in cases across the Sun Belt and into the South. You start to see, this kind of fundamental reconsideration of campuses. And so right now you have this mix of institutions that range from, we're going to have this hybrid model where some students will be on campus, some students will be staying home, all classes might be online, some classes might be online and in person. And then you have other institutions that are, such as Hampton University, things like the Cal State system out in California, that are basically saying, it's probably not safe to bring students back to campus. So I think that there's this interesting thing happening where this kind of range of plans from we're bringing students back to we're bringing some students back to we're not bringing any students back has made for sort of messy messaging on college reopening, and kind of where institutions are trying to say that we are supposed to be moral leaders on this. We're supposed to show the nation the way forward. When you have this discrepancy in how institutions are handling this, and everyone's handling it differently, it really makes that a difficult thing to message as kind of a place to look to for leadership.
And it's not necessarily falling on, sort of neat lines of, well, public universities are handling it one way and private universities are handling it another. I mean, you mentioned Cal State. That's obviously a public system that made a system-wide decision. Have we seen any other major systems make decisions that involve a number of colleges?
So we've seen community college systems kind of do similar things. But I mean, these were also institutions that were probably better prepared and probably already had it built in, this kind of online model of education. But there are a lot of considerations that both public and private institutions are making, where private institutions and public institutions in some cases are heavily tuition dependent, where we've seen state funding cut significantly over the last several decades. Dr. Tressie McMillan Cotton put it pretty succinctly the other day, where she was saying, now since you've been treating higher education as a business for so long, now you have to deal with customers. You have to deal with people who expect goods and services to be provided in a certain way. And when you are ultimately needing to change the product, they're going to be upset. So I think that colleges are dealing, particularly public colleges in this instance, are going to be dealing with pressure from state lawmakers. They're going to be dealing with pressure from students. They're going to be dealing with pressure from parents. And they're also dealing with pressure from faculty members. So there's a lot of considerations going into all of this, which makes for some of the messiness of the fall planning.
I do want to remind everybody who's watching, we can take questions live. So if you're a parent, a student, a faculty member, anybody who's concerned about how colleges will be handling reopening in the fall, please leave your comments and we will try to answer the questions as best as we can. It does seem like we're kind of running up on a deadline where parents and children and young adults who are making these decisions about whether or not they're going to go to in-person on-campus college in the fall need to make those decisions in order to move, to safely move and things like that. Where I live, Tuscaloosa, University of Alabama, they've said that all the students are going to be tested coming onto campus, and there will be random sentinel testing on campus as well. But I would imagine that's still kind of an alarming prospect if you're a prospective student in New Jersey or California who's looking at rising numbers in Alabama. What do you think is a reasonable timeline for parents to make some of these decisions?
I mean, you're right. We are kind of butting up against the deadline. I mean, August is less than 30 days away. So I think that a lot of institutions, this is why some of the Harvards and the Penns and institutions like that have been putting out their plans now to say, okay, time is basically running out. People need to make decisions within the next 10 to 15 days on what they'll be doing in the fall. And I think that there are, as you mentioned, some alarming signs. I mean, they've kind of had this natural test of what it might look like if you bring a range of students back when they brought football players back in June, and you have these football teams where a quarter of the team is tested positive for COVID, or a third of the team is tested positive for COVID. Ohio State and UNC have shut down their voluntary athletic activities because of COVID exposure. So I think that as one of the things that the president of James Madison University told me, I want to say this was back in May, is that we all realize that we can't control the virus. We just have to make plans for what happens in different situations. And I was talking to the University of California Assistant President Janet Napolitano yesterday, and I asked her kind of plainly, is there a hard out? Is there a situation where the cases get too bad, or there's an outbreak on campus or an outbreak in the area where you just kind of have to say, okay, we're going back to the online infrastructure that we had this spring? And she kind of unequivocally said, yes, there is a hard out. I feel like every institution across the country has that kind of contingency plan where they have a kind of a stopgap plan to get everyone back off of campus and to kind of slow the spread. But I think there are a lot of faculty members, staff members, parents, and students who are thinking, okay, well, if you have that, then have you also been planning, or why weren't you using these months to plan out a kind of robust online infrastructure that we could have gone to and kind of saved some of the theatrics of all of this?
Yeah, and then I think another question that I've seen kind of come up in the last week, especially after Harvard made their announcement that they were going to be moving most of, if not all of their instruction online, is, if all of the instruction is online, are students expected to still pay the full tuition like they would be for in-person education? I saw one person who I think called Harvard's a $40,000 series of YouTube lectures. I don't know that that's entirely fair. I think there's a lot more to online instruction than that, but should and as you said, these are businesses to some extent, even if they are public goods. Should universities expect students to pay full tuition for online education?
I think that the argument that a lot of institutions will make is that tuition has always been to cover the educational expenses rather than everything else. Like, there's the idea that your tuition covers your education, it covers your professors, it covers kind of the learning experience, and your fees and your room and board, that covers kind of everything else. There's a range of agreement, disagreement on that point, but I think that's the argument that the Harvards make, is that you're paying this amount for your education. I think there have been other institutions that have taken radically different paths there, where Hampton University in Virginia said that it was going to, when it said it was going online only and it wasn't bringing students back to campus, it cut its tuition by 15%. I think that there's going to be, if and when colleges come back in the fall, there's going to be a lot of conversation about this particular thing, primarily because when you see places that are like, okay, we're only going to bring back freshmen and juniors, or we're only going to bring back freshmen and sophomores, but then you also have your juniors and seniors, or you also have your sophomores and seniors who are still paying the full tuition, but they're not getting a campus experience at all. Are they getting short shrifted in some way? And I think, kind of to the earlier point, it's like when you have these different experiences for different people who are essentially paying the same price outside of maybe room and board, it creates this kind of chasm of well, if they're getting this experience and I'm not, why am I still paying that same amount? And it kind of creates more difficulties, and the messaging is messier than if they were to just say, we're bringing everyone back, or we're bringing them back.
Well, and on the university side of things, I would imagine that in some cases, moving a lot of traditionally in-person courses to online may wind up being more expensive than it otherwise would have been to have students on campus in the first place. Certainly for some faculty.
And it's, I mean, infrastructure-wise, there are a lot of institutions that might not have the infrastructure set up or did not have the infrastructure set up for kind of online education. I mean, for years, community colleges, commuter colleges, online education programs have been doing this very sort of education. So there are a lot of places that are equipped for it. But then there are some places that aren't. I mean, when I was talking to Paul LeBlanc, he's the president of Southern New Hampshire University, he was essentially saying that, you know, and I mean, they have a robust online program. I think it's more than 100,000 online students.
Oh, wow.
And so, you know, I'm talking to him and he's saying he's getting calls from presidents all across the country. And it's interesting because he says they always ask about, okay, how do you do the teaching part of it? But they weren't asking me about all of the wraparound services, the counseling, and the different things that students who take online classes need. And I think that is probably the part that would ultimately end up being most difficult in a lot of these situations, is that, yes, you can probably move the classes back online, but you probably won't have the same robust services in some cases that you would have on campus.
And certainly, you know, a number of the businesses in college towns that depend on, you know, students being in the community certainly will struggle, and in turn that may lead to, you know, the state and the universities struggling down the line as well. You happen to be working on a book about inequity in higher education. It's due to come out next summer. It's called "The State Must Provide." It seems like, you know, recessions often exacerbate inequities. I would imagine this pandemic may also exacerbate inequities. What have you learned about, you know, the kind of the history of racial and class inequity in higher education, and what are your concerns about going forward?
So to kind of give like a broad sweep of the book, it's kind of built on the idea and kind of tracing the history of kind of some of the fundamental inequities in higher ed. So if you're looking at the beginning of the public higher education system that we recognize today, it was kind of always funded inequitably. I mean, there are a lot of public institutions that received money in 1862 that public colleges for Black students did not receive. There were a lot of private institutions that received money that private Black institutions did not receive. And this was a matter of kind of government policy that stretches back more than 150 years. So kind of tracing that lineage to now, it has never been practically addressed. And when you see situations where states are having to start talking about cutting their budgets, where foundations are concerned about their ability to give grants and different things like that, there's kind of this recognition that the institutions that were already harmed are going to be ones where budget cut may be most devastating. When you have less money and you take money from that, it's going to be worse than if you have a lot of money. So it's really difficult to be poor, and that's something that a lot of institutions may be experiencing kind of in very short order. I think one of the big things when you're looking at one of the big things to kind of keep an eye on is how states kind of navigate their upcoming budgets, where they're pulling that money from, how cities and counties are navigating their budgets as well would be kind of a big thing to keep an eye on.
Now, in the wake of the last recession, you know, the 07-08 crisis, I know that a lot of newly graduating seniors, rather than try to risk finding a job in a terrible economy, chose the grad school, law school path, things like that. I would guess, based purely off of just a hunch, no evidence whatsoever, that the pandemic changes that equation for a lot of people, and so you might not see as many people choosing to go to grad school in the fall or in the spring as you would have otherwise seen, leading presumably to a hit not only to the students but also to the universities themselves. Have you seen any indication that is the case? Do you think we'll see another wave of law students this go around?
I think that, as you mentioned, it's kind of the pandemic planning is much different than the previous recession, where you saw people who were out of work, and it was kind of logical path to say, well, maybe I go back to school, maybe I retrain, maybe I try to get a new set of skills that may make me recession proof the next time one of these things happens. But with everything closing, it's just kind of a completely different calculation. I've asked kind of several higher education historians whether there was ever this radical of an event in higher ed, and their response was, the best analog would actually probably be something that was a positive for colleges and universities. Like, the only thing that was this radical of a shift in the last century was probably the GI Bill, where
wow.
you had kind of a radical growth of colleges and universities, where now you're probably going to see a constriction of the sector, particularly if there aren't any additional bailout funds. I mean, institutions are having to do a lot of things that they were not financially prepared for, including, putting plexiglass in classrooms and all of these little things that they need to do to make sure the campuses are safe. Switching to single occupancy public campus housing rather than double or quadruple occupancy campus housing, addressing shared bathrooms and things like that. And at some private colleges, your housing and things like that can make up to 25% of the budget.
Right.
So places are looking at kind of radical depletion of budgets, and trying to make ends meet with their budgets and the amount of money that they actually have. So,
what kind of money was included in the CARES Act for higher education?
yeah, so there were kind of billions of dollars in the CARES Act, particularly kind of earmarked to help higher ed. I think that the thing that everyone kind of knew going into this is that money was to help colleges get through the spring. They were always kind of going to need a new kind of fresh injection of funds to get through this fall semester and into the spring semester. And I think that's the part that kind of gets lost in all of this conversation, is that yes, these institutions receive some money to help make up the losses for, say, having to transition students out of campus housing and giving students housing refunds. There was at James Madison University, for example, they had already spent their CARES Act funding by the time that I had talked to them in May.
Wow.
So it wasn't even enough to kind of recoup the losses that they had from the previous semester. I think they had $30 million in losses and $11 million in CARES Act funding. But so I think that kind of going forward, if there's not a fresh injection of funds from the federal government, from the state legislature, which is already kind of, or from state legislatures which are already kind of drying up, where funds are kind of drying up, it's going to be an incredibly difficult situation for a lot of colleges that aren't flush with cash.
Well, and to get back to the inequities you were talking about earlier, I mean, I know at least in Alabama, the HBCUs have always been underfunded in terms of state funding. Do you get a sense that there will be schools, whether it's HBCUs or other smaller universities, that just don't survive a fall without in-person tuition?
I think that there is the possibility. As you know, I went to Alabama A&M, so
Right.
has a particularly special place in my heart. But I think that there is one of the things that, when you think about colleges that have the characteristics of those that are struggling, so institutions that have fewer than 2,000 students, institutions that have an endowment that's less than $50 million, colleges that are in rural areas. Those characteristics are being kind of really poked at, needled by the pandemic. So if they can't bring students back, if there's not a fresh injection of funding, those institutions will have an incredibly difficult time. HBCUs, there are a lot of HBCUs that have those similar characteristics. I have a hard time seeing states allowing public colleges to close. Typically, states will try to find a workaround. They will try to merge institutions. They'll try to host different things before they just run to closing institutions.
Mhm.
Private institutions will likely have a more difficult time kind of weathering that storm. And as they say, kind of when it rains, when white America sneezes, Black America catches the flu. It's kind of the same thing for
Yeah.
Black colleges. So when predominantly white institutions are struggling, Black colleges are going to struggle even more. So I think there are a lot of lobbying efforts from UNCF, from the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, that are really trying to get a new, fresh kind of federal injection of funds into those institutions.
Well, you mentioned that you are an Alabama A&M alum, so let's talk a little bit about college sports, because this could put the Magic City Classic at risk for the fall, I would think, which is not only huge for A&M but also huge for the city of Birmingham every year. So what happens to college sports? I mean, we're seeing some schools like Stanford that are eliminating programs. We're seeing some like the Ivy League that said they're not going to play fall sports. So what are you hearing these days?
Yeah, so I think that there was a lot of optimism around June that, in a controlled environment, you could have sports in the fall. And I mean, the places that were saying this were often big time college sports programs, the places that actually make money from college football, college basketball. So it is the University of Alabama, it's the University of Michigan, it's Ohio State, LSU. But as time progressed and you saw Clemson, where a third of their team ends up catching the coronavirus, you have LSU, you have University of Texas, Texas Tech. It's kind of led to this fundamental reconsidering of, okay, what if we actually can't contain this? What if a large swath of our players end up getting sick? Which is why you've seen places like Ohio State, University of North Carolina take a hard out on voluntary athletic training for this spring. But there are TV deals that are wrapped up in this. There are kind of any number of things that are kind of wrapped up in this for a lot of major college programs. So they're going to try as hard as they can to have sports in the fall. But kind of whether or not that's practical is a more difficult thing. I mean, we've seen that they have had trouble containing the virus when it's just athletes on campus. What happens when it's more than just athletes on campus? They're sending the NBA into a bubble to keep them protected. But you also have staff going in and out there. So I mean, you're never going to truly have a bubble. You're never going to be able to kind of police all activity around a team or players or anything of that sort. So I mean, it's really still kind of up in the air, regardless of what the NCAA or the SEC or anyone might want to say about kind of the finality of the decision. Because, as I was saying earlier, we can't really control the virus. We don't dictate what it does.
I do want to take that as a moment to do a quick plug for Monday's episode of the Reckon Interview podcast. I am chatting with Paul Finebaum about his thoughts about college sports. So please subscribe to that if you haven't already. To come back into what you were just talking about, college students, and as my wife often points out to me, their brains are still developing. We all saw the stories about rumors in Tuscaloosa of COVID parties. Whether or not students go to parties to get COVID, we know students will go to parties. Mm-hmm. You work for a publication that I think has covered the coronavirus better than just about anybody. What do you know about the impact that the virus can have on, 19-somethings, 20-somethings, and also, on the faculty that would potentially be at risk on campus?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that has kind of been most apparent is that even if it's not devastating for everyone, there are still those who it can be particularly devastating for. I mean, if you're looking at the amount of cases that you've had among football teams, some of the healthiest students on campuses, what happens when you bring back students who may not be as healthy? They end up catching the virus. We've already seen one student recently who's died from complications of the coronavirus. We've seen that at the University of Texas, a custodial a member of the custodial staff died of the coronavirus. So this is starting to affect campuses in very real ways. And as you mentioned, you can't stop 19, 20, 21-year-olds from attending parties, from going to see their friends, from hanging out. I mean, there are some students who kind of go to colleges for kind of the express purpose of finding themselves, of hanging out with people. It's the first time that a lot of students are being away from their families. Of course, you know, there's been a shift in higher ed where there are a lot of adult students, but for kind of that traditional base of student, that 18 to 24-year-old, they are going to want to socialize in a lot of cases. So there's a part of all of these plans that relies on trusting students, trusting trusting people to abide by the social distancing protocols that they've been provided, but it's really difficult to enforce that in meaningful ways. And you know, it really only takes one or two times of a student kind of breaking that policy for an event to occur where multiple students end up being exposed. So I don't know, it's kind of factored into all of this. Michael Sorrell, the president of Paul Quinn College in Dallas, actually wrote a really interesting piece for The Atlantic a couple of months ago, which was, you know, college presidents are deluding themselves. They're saying that, you know, we have this under control. We know what we can do. We can keep students from doing X. We can keep students from doing O. But is that practically true? Is that a realistic thing that's achievable? Probably not. It's going to be really difficult to kind of police student behavior outside of simply trusting them to do what's right.
We do have a question from Sean Strickler on the sports topic. Can you have sports with only athletes on campus? At that point, are they still students or are they employees? I think that's a pertinent question for right now.
Yeah, and that is I think that was kind of the really big thing in June when, you know, campuses were essentially saying it's not safe to have all students back on campus, but we can bring athletes back for workouts. I think that there is colleges are going to have to fundamentally address why that was. Why is it okay to bring college athletes back into an environment that is not safe for most students? Even if you say, oh, we can keep them in a bubble, we can keep them protected, you're kind of fundamentally putting them in a different class of people on campus than you are than just a general student. So I think that there are a lot of questions that are being kind of raised by this current moment of athlete pay, of kind of the treatment of student athletes on campus, and kind of the financial impact that they have at some institutions. I mean, you can kind of you can see how there's a difference between the University of Alabama, which brings football players back, and Morehouse College, which says, you know, we're not going to be playing football in the fall, and, you know, we're gonna keep our student athletes off of campus as much as possible.
And this isn't COVID related. I mean, I guess it is kind of COVID related, but, you know, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the protest movements that have followed, we are seeing, and in the wake of the pandemic, we are seeing some college athletes, whether it's the University of Texas football team, that are starting to kind of flex their muscles in terms of being able to enact change on campus. We saw it a few years ago at Mizzou with the football team there getting involved with the Ferguson protests. Is this kind of a turning point for how college athletes view their role in campus climate?
I think it may be. I mean, it has been kind of interesting to watch over the last couple of weeks how those athletes have kind of flexed their collective muscle, how they flex their individual muscle in terms of saying, oh, well, maybe I'm going to go to an HBCU instead of, we saw Maker go to announce that he was committing to Howard University. And he's, you know, 5-star basketball recruit. I think that in addition to this being an interesting moment for athletes kind of exerting their power and exerting their influence in campuses, it's also a moment where university leaders feel that they are in a position where they can't not respond to those requests. I feel like, you know, there's this kind of broad understanding of how racism has kind of been pervasive and has reached its tentacles into every area of society. And I think that colleges, which kind of espouse these ideas of liberalism and have served as this kind of beacon of a better future, if you will, and kind of these humanities ideas, they are kind of forced to reckon with how the people who they've honored with legacies on buildings, and then the people who they've named programs after, how that fits into their moral mission. And if they realize that this is not something that fits well into our moral mission, then they have kind of an obligation to address that. So I think that these athletes' concerns, where they may not have felt comfortable expressing them in the past, they now feel comfortable expressing them. And also, you have administrations that feel that they have to listen and respond appropriately.
Right. Well, Adam, thank you so much for your time today. Everybody, you can go follow him on Twitter at AdamHSays. His book comes out next summer, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future, Adam.
Thanks so much for having me.